Good morning, everyone. My name is Jose Hidalgo. Um, Please excuse the delay we were having this morning due to technical difficulties. If you're just joining us, we're going to go ahead and get started in just a couple of minutes. Mm, I see people are still coming in the room, so we'll allow them a couple of more minutes. Then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so like I said, my name is Jose Hidalgo, and we'll get started with the webinar. I also want to make sure that I announce that this presentation is available with automatic closed captioning. Additionally, we're providing simultaneous interpretation in Spanish this morning, for which I will now provide instructions for our Spanish Zoom attendees. Hoy siempre brindamos servicios de interpretación simultánea para nuestros eventos, igual en persona o en Zoom. Favor de hacer clic en el globo al fondo de su pantalla donde dice interpretación, luego haga clic en el idioma que desea escuchar, en este caso español. Si quiere escuchar solo al intérprete, puede hacer clic en Mute Original Audio o callar audio original, que silenciaría el audio original. Muchas gracias y de nuevo bienvenidos a Sinergia. Estamos agradecidos de tenerles aquí. Okay, before we begin, I want to let you know that we're also going to be recording today's webinar. And let's go through a few housekeeping notes. Everyone who's registered via Zoom will receive a copy of the presentation slides via follow-up email within the next few days. A survey will be shared in the chat and a QR code at the end of the presentation. We will have at the end of the presentation a Q&A. We encourage questions at any time. However, please remember that this is a public forum. So like I mentioned before, my name is Jose Hidalgo. I am the trainer and development director for the Metropolitan Parent Center at Synergia. A few words about Synergia's Autism Initiative. The Autism Initiative project is funded by a grant from the New York City Council under its Autism Initiative. This project supplements the work of Synergia's Metropolitan Parent Center by bringing increased awareness to New York residents, particularly to the communities with large Spanish-speaking populations, about the growing number of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Its strong outreach components targets families of children with a suspected or known diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, ASD, who are not receiving appropriate educational, health, and other related services. The initiative will link them to other services and supports that meet the individual needs of children and their families. I want to thank you all for joining us. We're glad you choose to be with us today. For those of you joining us, after the presenter concludes their presentation, we will have a question and answer Q&A session. If you are joining us on Zoom and via Facebook Live, if you have questions, please place them on the comments section. So now I want to hand it over to our presenter today, Ross Baker. Ross, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Aussie. My name is Ross Baker. like Ozzy said. I am on the school justice project at Advocates for Children of New York, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Special Ed 101 today. So thanks everyone for joining. I know it's a bit of a weird day with the snow day in schools, and there's just a lot going on. So I hope everyone is safe and taking care of themselves. Just a heads up, I'm coming off a little bit of a cold, so if I pause to grab water or something, I just wanted to let people know. Um, but I'll do my best to answer any questions that come up. Um, and yeah, well, for now, I'll get into the presentation. So the roadmap for today's training uh, is I'm going to do a bit of an introduction about AFC and about the topic, an overview of Section 504 and IDEA. Then I'm going to talk about the special education process, the special education options, and disregard that last point. Actually, I that should be changed, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can escalate or get recourse if you're having issues throughout the special education process. So, um, the laws that protect students with disabilities in New York City public schools um, are the following. So we have Section 504, the Individuals with Disability Education Acts, or IDEA, New York State regulations, the Part 200s, and then the New York City Public Schools Standard Operating Procedures Manual. Just a heads up, I know that New York City Public Schools is now called New York City Public Schools. In the past, it's been called the DOE or the NYC DOE. So if you hear me referring to DOE throughout this presentation, um, just know it means New York City Public Schools. It's kind of just a force of habit. So um, I don't mean to confuse anyone, but I just wanted to give folks a heads up that that might be the reason that I'm using DOE or New York City Public Schools interchangeably. So the first law I mentioned is Section 50, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So this is a federal law. It applies to organizations that get federal funding, like public schools, for example. So what this law says is that these organizations cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, and schools must provide reasonable accommodations. So, for example, some student accommodations that go in a 504 plan can include classroom accommodations, testing accommodations, assistive technology, nursing services, physical modifications, and health paraprofessionals. And then we have a more extensive guide to Section 504, which is linked here in the presentation. Um, as Ozzy mentioned, the presentation should get sent out to anyone who's registered so you can engage with the links uh, found throughout the presentation. Um, so just a heads up, I talk about 504 fairly briefly, just because we're going to focus a bit more on the next part, the IDEA, as this covers IEPs, which you may have heard of, and it's a bit more common in New York City to see students get services through the IDEA. So the IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what it says is all children through age 21 with a disability have the right to a free, appropriate public education. This is also known as FAPE. There's a lot of acronyms. You don't have to remember this one, but the idea is all students have the right to a free, appropriate public education. And it's a very simple concept, but it can get a bit tricky, and I'll explain why later and what this actually looks like in practice. And then the second part of this law is students have the right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And again, I'll explain what this means. This one's a little bit less clear based on the name. but I'll hopefully be able to break down what these two things mean, so you have a good understanding of what this law means and how it looks for children who are in New York City public schools. So, free appropriate public education means programs and services to help students make appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. So this is specially designed instruction to meet the child's unique needs and achieve challenging objectives. Um, what's really important about this is that it's for each individual child. So you'll see that make appropriate progress here is in bold. As appropriate progress for each child in light of their circumstances won't always look the same as it does for other children. So basically, what it means is FAPE is a vehicle to make progress from point A to point B in one's learning. Um, as appropriately as possible. So it's the metaphor here is it's a Toyota, not a Ferrari. Um, it's not a bunch of extra things added on just for the sake of excelling or learning a bunch of like additional things that isn't appropriate in the New York City public school system. It's more a vehicle to help students get from point A to point B. But this vehicle might look different for all students. So the second part of this is the least restrictive environment. And the goal is inclusion here. So what this means is as much as it's possible, students with disabilities must learn with students who do not have disabilities. Um, but again, this exists together with the first part, the free and appropriate public education, where appropriate is really the important word here. And what it means is that for some students, their most appropriate education uh, might be in an environment with students who do not have disabilities, but for other students, the most appropriate environment to learn, to make appropriate progress, might, for example, be in a placement with students uh, who have disabilities, where they're not, in the same classroom as general education students. But the goal here is inclusion. So to the extent which it's possible, the goal is to have students learn, students with disabilities learn with students who do not have disabilities. So here is a quick timeline of the special education process. So the first step is referral. And then following that, there's consent that is given by the parents, or guardians of educational rights, then the evaluation, then the IEP development, and then placement slash services. So this is, the step where students are actually receiving services, or in their appropriate class placement on their IEP. So before I get into the timeline a little bit, I want to mention some pre-referral interventions. So for students with academic or behavioral needs, there are interventions that students can receive through New York City Public Schools. Uh, these are academic intervention services, which could be response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support. These are required if students receive promotion in doubt letters. These don't require special education evaluation, and they're not part of the special ed process. So, for example, if a student has already been referred for special education, um, this means that they can still receive these services prior to the entire special ed process happening. So these should be available to all students. Um, and you can ask your school about these types of services and what types of supports they have. And if your child receives promotion in doubt letter, then these are required services for them to receive. But like I said before, these are not part of the special ed process. So who can make a referral for special education? Parents or legal guardians or the school. So by law, these are the only people who are able to make the actual referral. So either a parent or legal guardian with education rights or the school itself. Others can request a referral, but they can't formally make the referral for special education. So to refer a student, um, you usually want to do this in writing. Um, Email a letter to the principal, the school-based support team, or the committee on special education. Um, and parents can email requests too. Um, and the last point here is about something called child find. So, like it says towards the top of the screen here, schools have the ability to make a referral. And this is because of something called child find. And what this means is it means that schools, as professionals, have the responsibility to identify when they suspect a child of having a disability. And if they do, then they are required to make a referral to the school. Um, I saw a question, but I think Aussie's handling it. Yeah, slides will be sent out to anyone
Thanks
who
for us.
registered.
I'll take care of
Yeah.
your questions. I'll compound them and share them with you
Okay.
by the end. Thank you.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. Um, but yeah, that's a great example though. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to send them. Um, all right. And the one thing I'll note here is we always recommend making a referral in writing. So even if you have a conversation with the school or talk over the phone, it's always helpful to follow up with an email just because, there's a legal timeline for these things. And it's hard to point to like a phone conversation or a meeting with the school. Whereas if you have something in writing, it helps down the line in case, the process is moving slowly or there are any hiccups in the process. So the next part on the timeline that I shared before is consent. So within 10 school days of the referral, the school must uh, have the parent give consent to evaluate. So this is within 10 school days. Um, and like I said, this is kind of why you want something in writing because there's a legal standard for this. And consent must be written, voluntary, and informed. And parents can withdraw consent at any time throughout the process. So, after consent is given for an evaluation, the following must happen within 60 school days. So, any evaluations that are agreed upon, the IEP meeting, and then the placement slash services. So this means that within 60 school days, basically the rest of the process should happen. Students should be evaluated. There should be an IEP meeting. Um, and then the student should be receiving placement slash services within 60 school days. For reevaluations, the 60 school day clock starts on the date of re-referral. So what should an evaluation include? Students must be tested in all areas of suspected disability. So often this looks like social history. So this is an interview or conversation with a parent about students' health and sort of like history from birth until the time of the evaluation. So this will include developmental milestones, some information about the family, their living situation. Then there will be a psychoeducational. This is usually a battery of cognitive tests and different types of tests that the child will do with the school psychologist or a psychologist from the district who is trained in administering these tests. Then there's a classroom observation. So this is to observe how the child engages with the content in the classroom, how they behave. A recent physical, uh, and then a vocational assessment for students ages 12 and older. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is an assessment that has students with disabilities start thinking about sort of what types of things they're interested in after they graduate and how they plan to proceed, um, once they're out of the New York City public school system and how New York City public school system can support them through the IEP in this capacity. So reevaluations must be conducted once every 3 years. They're called a triennial. However, they may happen sooner if the school or parent requests it. Um, they may not occur more than once a year unless the school district and parent agree otherwise, and they must occur before declassification. So this means that a student must be evaluated before an IEP is discontinued. So a reevaluation may happen sooner. For example, if a student is making a lot of progress, or if the student is falling behind, or for example, maybe there's new behaviors that they're observing in school. This could be a reason for an evaluation to happen sooner than the 3-year cycle, which is legally required. IEPs and evaluations are not the same thing. A student's IEP must be reviewed annually, and IEP meetings are held every year. Um, So throughout the evaluation process, it is possible to have outside evaluations. These can include psychiatric evaluations, neuropsychological evaluations, disagree with DOE evaluations, or other types of specialized evaluations. So there's a process where if it's agreed upon between the school and the parent and the family,
Well,
um, yep,
excuse me, I need to interrupt you for a second. It seems like our interpreter has is experiencing some technical difficulties and
okay.
she dropped out of the interpretation room. We don't know if she's going to be able to reconnect, but if she does, I'll pop her back in the room. But for now, the interpretation services are not working. Um, a todos los que están escuchando en español, necesitamos hacerles saber que tenemos problemas técnicos y nuestra interpretadora se ha desconectado del cuarto. No sabemos si se va a poder reconectar, pero en caso de que eso pase, vamos a devolverla al cuarto de interpretación. Por ahora, los servicios de interpretación no están funcionando. Ross, please go ahead and resume with your presentation. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Okay, sounds good. Um, so if, for example, these evaluations can happen if it's agreed upon between the parent and the school or the DOE that they are necessary. So, for example, uh, if it seems like the school or the placement is unable to support the child and and the school needs more information on how to better support the child, then one of these evaluations could be an option. Um, It is possible to get a disagree with a DOE evaluation. This is if you disagree with how the DOE has evaluated your child. And usually, what this means is that you would take them to an alternative evaluation where you would pay out of pocket. And if the results are different than the DOE's evaluation, then the DOE would compensate you for the cost of that evaluation. Occasionally, the DOE is able to provide these types of evaluations, but typically these are reserved for outside providers, um, as most DOE schools don't have the staff to support these types of evaluations. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about an IEP. I've used the phrase. It's an individual education plan. It's individualized, it's legally binding, like a contract, and this is really important. So what that means is everything on the IEP must be given to the student. They're good for 1 year, and now some IEP meetings are taking place by phone or video conference. Um, so the first point that it's individualized is very important, because two students might have the same classification on their IEP, but the actual content included in their IEP might be completely different. So this is really what I was talking about when I was talking about a free, appropriate public education. The IEP is supposed to be tailored to the specific student for how they are going to make progress in light of their circumstances. So who attends the IEP meeting? Um, the parent, special ed teacher, general ed teacher if the student is or may be in any general ed classes, the school psychologist, um, district representative, the student if it's deemed appropriate by the parents, and then other people. So parents have a right to a 7-day notice for an IEP. Um, Special education teacher should participate in the IEP meeting. Sometimes the school psychologist and district representative might be the same person. So typically the school psychologists in a lot of schools work across several different schools, so they're aware of all the services in the district, and they can make a recommendation for the placement um, for a student following the IEP meeting. Other people here might be interpreters. If you require interpretation, you have a right to an interpreter in an IEP meeting. You also can bring parent advocates um, or outside providers if they're willing to participate. So, for example, if your child works with a therapist outside of school and the therapist knows your child very well and can speak to their progress, um, it might be a good idea to have them join the IEP meeting, as the IEP meeting is where the parents and the school come together to decide what services the student will receive in school. So, for an IEP meeting, it's really important to ask for any reports or evaluations before the meeting. Um, it's important to get a copy of the attendance sheet, so figure out who's there and what everyone's role is. Get a draft of the recommendations and services immediately after the IEP meeting. So this is the part where the school and family agree on what services will be provided or what type of school placement the child is in. Um, so you can request this right away. This won't be the full IEP meeting or the full IEP, which will have everything that's discussed, but it will be the portion which says what services the student will receive for the year, and then get the finalized IEP and compare it to any notes you took from the meeting. And all concerns that you brought up should be mentioned in the IEP, even if they aren't incorporated into the IEP. They should at least be mentioned on the document. And then we have a link to a translated IEP program in the presentation. And like we mentioned before, any the presentation should be sent out to any registered participants after the presentation. Uh, so you can look at any of the links that we have throughout the presentation. So the sections of an IEP are the following. Present levels of performance, the recommended program, transition plan, a functional behavioral assessment or behavior intervention plan, related services or assistive technology, the promotion criteria, annual goals, testing accommodations, and parent concerns. So present levels of performance is to discuss how the student is currently performing in classes and how they're performing relative to um, the annual goals from the last IEP. And it's very important that these typically have some sort of numerical or quantitative value so you can assess how the student's making progress. So these should be pretty specific, and this is how we determine what appropriate progress looks like. So, for example, if one of my annual goals is for my IEP is Ross will do better in reading next year. It's not very helpful because we don't know what better means. We don't know how to measure that. We don't know um, what that looks like as it relates to my present levels of performance. So this should typically have information about maybe reading comprehension, word processing, um, grade level reading, things that indicate a specific level, so that we can see how a student's actually improving over time, rather than just saying, oh, the student's doing better or the student's not doing better. It's really important to have metrics that we can follow. The recommended program is the classroom placement that the student's in. So this could be a general ed class, uh, an integrated code teaching class, or a specialized class. And I'll talk a little bit more about these sorts of things later. Transition plan, this is related to what I mentioned before about the vocational assessment. So this is typically for older students who are thinking about how they're going to transition to life after leaving New York City public schools. So this might be how their IEP is going to support them transition to college, or how it's going to help them transition to a vocational program or a job or job training. But this is typically something for older students. The FBA and BIP or BIP, this is not in every IEP, but for some students, they have what's called a functional behavioral assessment if they have a specific behavior that they're exhibiting in class. And this is basically how the school plans to address that behavior, and how the family and school are going to work together uh, to address that targeted behavior. Related services, these are things like speech therapy or occupational therapy. So sometimes these services are happening in class in small groups, or students are being pulled out of class to receive one-on-one services. Um, AT is assistive technology. So these are things like e-readers, or any devices that help a student learn appropriately should they need them. Like I mentioned before, promotion criteria and annual goals kind of go together. Um, these are measurable goals for how a student is going to progress to the next grade and how they're going to be evaluated at next year's IEP meeting. Testing accommodations. So these can be things like, students might need breaks throughout testing or extra time. But any testing accommodations should be included in IEP. And then the last part is parental concerns. So the IEP should be collaborative, but if there are concerns that aren't addressed in the IEP, as far as like a recommended program or student's placement, they should be addressed in the parent concerns section. So, like I mentioned in the last slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the program recommendation. So, what this is the actual learning environment where the student will be for the next year following an IEP. So after the IEP meeting, the school will email out a prior written notice, which describes the program, types of school and services on an IEP, and a school location letter. So this is if after an IEP, they're changing the program and saying that a student might be moved to a specialized school or a different school, and this will include the school location letter and where the student will attend school to receive their services. Right. So these are now I'm going to talk a little bit about program options and special education options. So when I talk about program, these are sort of the types of things I'm referring to. So like I mentioned before, there are related services. So these could be counseling, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language therapy, transition services, or special education teacher support services, which is specifically designed instruction from a special education teacher. These services can happen in really any program or any classification. So, I could be in a general ed class and maybe I get pulled out twice a week for speech therapy. Or I work in a small group within the class and receive um, occupational therapy. But these are services that can happen inside the classroom or outside the classroom, but they're typically individual or in a smaller group. But I could be in any type of classroom placement to receive these services. So I could be in a general ed class, I could be in an integrative co-teaching class, or I could receive these services if I were in, a specialized school. where my class was a self-contained class only with students with other disabilities. Um, Other supports and services are paraprofessionals. So these are staff who support the students with addressing individual needs. So some examples are behavioral paras, transportation para who supports the student um, as they're going to and from the school on the bus. Assistive technology, like I mentioned before, so this could be a communication device or a different type of software that helps me communicate uh, or helps me do work. Nursing services, this is for students who have specific health needs that need nursing services throughout the day. And then the behavior intervention plan, which I mentioned before. Um, so if a student in New York City is not receiving mandated services on their IEP, you can request these items from the IEP team. So related services authorization or a P4 letter, which is a SEDS voucher. And these are services that they can receive outside of school if they're not receiving the services on their IEP. And these are basically waivers that will direct you where to go to get services um, and we'll say the amount that the DOE will pay the outside providers for the services. So, um, way back towards the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the least restrictive environment. And before what I was just discussing were special education supports and services. Um, this is now more related to placement. So as I mentioned before, I can receive the services I was just mentioning in the last few slides in any of these placements. Um, but the placements now are actually the type of class that the student will be in throughout the year. So the least restrictive environment for a student with disabilities would be a general education class with supports and services. So this might be a general education class where I am pulled out once a week and I receive maybe occupational therapy, but this would not be what's considered a very restrictive placement because most of my learning happens among general education students in a mainstream setting. A little bit more restricted might be an integrated co-teaching class. So this is a class setting where half the students have IEPs uh, with integrated co-teaching on their IEP, and half the students are general ed students. And typically there's two teachers in this classroom. There's a general ed teacher and a special ed teacher. Um, there are specific autism spectrum programs like NEST, which are uh, also a little bit less restrictive. And going down the spectrum here, uh, a little bit more restrictive might be a specialized class in a community school. So this is a class where I'm only learning around other students who have disabilities, and there are no other general education students in the class. Um, and then these numbers here are indicative of ratios. So a 12 to 1 to 1 might mean 12 students who are all students with disabilities with one teacher and one paraprofessional for the class. Um, and more restrictive placements are specialized classes in a specialized school. So this could be a District 75 school, which some folks may have heard of. And what this means is uh, I might be in a self-contained class with students with disabilities, and the rest of the school only supports students with disabilities. So there are no general ed students in the school. And as you'll see, these ratios here get smaller. So these might be students who need more targeted intervention and smaller ratio. So there could be, for example, 8 students in a class with one teacher and one paraprofessional, um, or 6 students to one teacher and one paraprofessional. But these are typically more restrictive environments. More restrictive than this are state-approved non-public schools. So if, for example, it's determined in an IEP meeting and through evaluations that a student, that the DOE is unable to support a student with any of the class options they have available, then they might say, okay, we think the student is a quality candidate for a state-approved non-public school, which can provide specialized instruction. And if a student is um, designated to go to a state-approved non-public school, then this means that the DOE will pay for the tuition if it's on the IEP. And this is part of what we described when we were talking about a free and appropriate public education. Um, the most appropriate public education for a certain student might be a program that the DOE itself doesn't offer. So more restrictive is residential placement. These are programs where students spend most of their week actually at the school, including overnight. And then for some students with significant medical needs, they might receive home instruction. I know it's a lot of information. Like I mentioned before, the slides will be sent out, and I'll also have information on uh, how to engage with the material in the presentation uh, afterwards and who to contact. So if you disagree with a classification, we always advise folks to start with a school. So this can be reaching out to the teacher, IEP team, or principal. If you feel like you're not getting support from the school, then you escalate to the superintendent's office. So this could be the administrator or directors of special education for the district. If you feel like you're not getting support from the district, then you can reach out to DOE Central. And we have the number here and the email for DOE Central. Um, so this is just a slide on who to contact if you're having issues throughout the special ed process. So if it's related services, we have an email here. If it's for the kindergarten IEP process, we have their email here. Um, Special ed and charter schools, this is overseen by the Committee on Special Education. And then there's an email for specialized programs as well. All right, so now if those escalations aren't working, there are some formal pathways that you can pursue for a dispute resolution. And I'll go through them in just a sec. So one option is reconvening an IEP meeting. If you disagree with the IEP classification, you can ask to reconvene the meeting and maybe see if someone from the district can participate um, or someone else who can support you throughout that process. Uh, you can then also request mediation. This is handled by a third party, and this is a conference between you and the school that is mediated by a professional group to discuss uh, issues where you might not see eye to eye on the IEP and figure out how to come to a collaborative solution. The next is an impartial hearing. This is a more formal process, and this is a legal process where you basically present evidence of why you disagree with the school and how the school hasn't implemented what they said they would on the IEP. And it's overseen by an impartial hearing officer. And then following that, there's a state or Office of Civil Rights complaint. Um, so like I mentioned before, mediation is a voluntary meeting between the parent and the DOE to discuss the problem. A mediator facilitates. Parties control the outcome. So this requires some negotiation um, and some discussion. An impartial hearing, however, is more formal. It's a legal proceeding. An impartial hearing officer is in charge. Um, and there's a written decision based on witnesses and documentary evidence, and you can appeal the decision. So now wrapping up, parents have the right to consent to or reject special education evaluations and services, request new evaluations, including independent evaluations, have an interpreter and get evaluations translated, and have their child's evaluation before the school changes their child's school placement. Um, so now that we're all set, if you have any questions, whether they're general or specific to your child's circumstance, we always encourage families to reach out to our helpline at AFC. They're open Mondays through Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our entire helpline staff speaks English and Spanish. We also have a language line that allows us to uh, interpret additional languages, but no question is too big or too small to reach out to helpline. So thanks everyone. I'm gonna put a link to the survey in the chat. You'll also see the QR code up here. But we asked folks to complete this so we can get feedback on how we can improve. And now I think I'll turn it over to Osi for questions or
Yes.
any other reminders from Synergia.
Thank you, Ross. That was a great presentation, very informative and complete about a very complex subject like a special education system. We do have a few questions on the Q&A.
Okay.
So the first one is from Maria Salcedo. It says, do you know any organization that provides free or low-cost math tutoring for an autistic 10th grader living in Queens, New York?
Um, I personally don't off the top of my head. However, I would say that that's a great question to uh, reach out to our helpline with. I think they should have a pretty comprehensive list because we encounter a lot of families with these sorts of things. Um, you could also reach out to your administrator of special education. They should know resources for families in the district. But I personally, off the top of my head, don't.
Great, thank you, Ross. The next one from Maria Salcedo as well says, can you explain what declassification means in terms of evaluations?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, what declassification means is this is when it's determined that a student no longer is classified as having the disability that they were classified as having before. So rather than just ending the services and saying, like, for example, if on my IEP it says I have another health impairment, rather than 1 year going to an IEP meeting and saying, um, Ross is no longer classified as having another health impairment, he's not going to receive services in class anymore. What it means is that there has to be an evaluation to show that, um, I'm not meeting the threshold for having this classification and that it is appropriate now for me to no longer receive services. So rather than just making that decision because it seems like maybe my grades are improving or things are getting easier for me in some way, there has to be an evaluation that actually shows that I don't need that support anymore.
Got it. Thank you for that answer. And moving on to the next question from Eileen Dolmo. It says, can you explain how to apply for a Nickerson letter? Thank you.
Okay, so a Nickerson letter is a letter where uh, if the school determines that your child needs a certain type of placement that they can't offer, that the DOE can't offer, then you apply for a Nickerson letter that says that you can then go, for example, find a state-approved non-public school. Um, to support your child. So this would be if there's an acknowledgement that your child needs services that the school or the DOE can't provide. Then you would reach out to either the special ed office, the central one that I mentioned before, or your district's special ed team.
Got it. Thank you. And we have another question from Eileen Dolmo. Is there a direct number and contact person for advocates for children? Thank you in advance.
So, the best way to get in touch with us and to get connected directly with an advocate is through our helpline, which is here on this current slide. We also have on our website, we have a direct submission form. So if you don't want to try calling in, you can email us directly with a description of your situation. And then one of my colleagues in our parent center will help uh, determine how best to support you, whether it's through advice, resources, or if it's getting, connected to a specific advocate or attorney at AFC. But those are really the two best ways to contact us. So our helpline, if they feel like, they can't support your issue, then they'll try to connect you to an advocate at AFC or our info intake email, which you can find on our website.
Got it. Thank you, Ross. And we have one final question on the Q&A. It's from Jacqueline Camacho. Can you have a mediation or impartial hearing if your child is in a special education private school and you are not satisfied with the services provided at the school or accommodations are not being met as expected?
Um, I believe so. You should have an IEP that you create with the school at the beginning of the year. Um, and if you disagree with the services they're receiving or you feel like they're not, then you should notify your district administrator of special education uh, and think about next steps from there. Um, but yeah, typically, services should be agreed upon uh, at the beginning of the school year. And if they're not receiving the services, then um, yes, I believe you can go to an impartial hearing.
Perfect. Thank you, Ross. There's no more questions. If anyone has any other question, now is your time to either type it in the QA chat or you can also unmute yourself and ask questions if you like. But if there's no more questions, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Ross, for a great presentation. Um, oh, I see Valeria is raising their hand. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, my question is I have a child that I want to register for school and he's in the early intervention program. Um and I have the packet, but do I also have to go online and register him with the Department of Education as if he's a regular student? Because I have the special ed paperwork, I got the packet, I got the paperwork to get him evaluated. And then on the Department of Education website, the deadline is this Friday. Do I still have to also register him with the Department of Ed website also? You have to do both? Oh,
Uh,
no.
I believe so, but I can't answer that for sure. I don't work with early childhood, but what I can tell you is if you go on our website at advocatesforchildren.com, we have several webinars that we've just done on the process of early intervention and beginning kindergarten as
Oh,
this
okay.
process just happened. So if you
Okay.
go on our website, um, Advocates for Children, .org, then you can find these presentations. And one of my colleagues, I'm just looking it up on my phone right now just to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. Yeah, I put in the chat, there will be presentations by one of my colleagues on this whole process.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, Ross. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation on Special Education 101. Special thanks to our presenter, Ross, for leading this webinar on such a great, important subject. We remind you that there's a survey that we posted on our chat. Please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey about today's presentation. Thank you again to everyone that joined us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone, and stay safe in the snow. Bye.
Bye.